Hi guys, this is the third video about MAUI data binding. So data binding is basically the process of having some data that you want to display in a GUI or having some data entered by the user in a GUI and wishing to save them to the underlying data. So that's what this automates. And you always have a source and a target. And you should think of the source as the underlying data and the target as the GUI element. Naturally, the source can be any target. It can also be a GUI view, but that's not common. And the target is basically it's a view, right? It's like an entry or a radio button. So, theoretically, it should be anything inheriting from bindable objects. Okay, which they all do. Okay, I think I said this already. So, but again, the source is the underlying data, and the target is the control in the GUI. Okay, and this is like another description of this. You have two properties in two objects, and data binding is the technique of linking them, synchronizing them, such that changes in one is reflected in the other automatically. So what you want with data binding is you want to avoid the writing the code to push data from one property to the other. Okay, and here's a sketch of how this is done. So again, we have the target here, and we have the source here, and in between we have a binding object. But it's not, the target is not just the object, it's actually a property in the object. Same with the source, we need to describe which property are we talking about. For instance, if the source is an entry, it could be the text property, but it could be any other property also. It has like a million properties. There's also various ways of doing it using the binding mode. It could be one way, a two-way, or one way to source. I'll get back to that. Okay, so here's an example. Suppose we have a person, very simple class, and this is the source, and we want to bind its properties to two controls. And I'm going to show this in the real world now. Let's see if we can find it here. Okay, so first let's take a look at my user interface. So I have one entry here, and I have one entry here. Let's just remove this experiment here. There you go. Okay, so I want this entry to be bound to the name property of a person object, and this one to be bound to the age property of a person object. And see, what we do in the example file is we say which property on the target, that is, which property on the entry do we wish to bind? And that's the text property in this case. And we have the syntax, we say we want to use binding. Instead of giving it a specific value, like I could have just written text equals blah, blah, blah. Well, that did not work out too well. Like that. But instead of doing that, I say I want this to be computed runtime by a binding. And I want to bind to this property. So this is the name of the property that I want to bind to. Same here, I want to bind to this property. Okay. But I did not specify which, let's remove this, just a person, ordinary person, like that. I did not specify which object I want to bind to. Well, that did not work out too well. There you go. Okay, so this is the object that I want to specify, that I want to bind to. And this could, of course, have been something that you looked up from a database, and this is a dialogues window where you want to display this person and allow the user to make changes. So this one might be, instead of hard coding it here, it could have been part of maybe a constructor, or you could set it somehow, or that's irrelevant for this case because this is just an example. Okay, so we have the source here, and now we want to say that that our target, which is this, let's find it here. This is the target, this entry. Remember, the name causes a variable of that name to be created. So we want to set the binding context, which is a property, on the text, on the entry. And we want to set it equal to this. So now you can see if we go back to this. So I want to set which is the target, which is its bound property, what is the source, what is its bound property. So the target is handled almost exclusively in the XAML file. Here it's binding, this is the text property, and this is the target, and this is the target property. So as for the source, we set the source in two places, and we set the property of the source in the XAML file, but the actual object we set here. Okay, so we're always setting this on the target. We're saying target's source should be this. Okay. So this is a simple situation. And this is just what I showed you. So the binding context is the source. I don't know why they didn't use the term source for this property, but they didn't. But it's what we mean by the source. And it could be anything. It could be a view, it could be a person instance, it could be anything. Okay, so let's see how this runs. There you go. Okay, so it's displayed Bob here and H37. Let's see, I also have something to show you what is actually in the object. And let's see if we change this to Joe instead. And now it's changed in the object. See? Here. So I want to show you something else. Not this one. So I made this show button. I display an alert where I'll type out the person's name and age. I also have one where I change them. So I want to see if I change them to, maybe not Joe, it's not there. Let's try something here. Bob, get back to Bob. Bob, okay, and now let's see if we change this to Joe. Nothing happened, but we'll fix that shortly. But for now, we can display objects. And if we write in these, it's reflected back to the source. So the source is displayed in the target, and the target is the target changes in the target is pushed back to the source. Okay. So I said that I would get back to the binding mode. Binding mode has you can change the binding mode, first of all, in the XAML file. For instance, to one way. If you change it to one way, it means that it's displayed in the target, but changes in the target is not reflected in the source. can see that in this arrow here, changes to the source. The source is displayed in the target, but the target is not reflected in the source. You can have two-way also, and as you saw in my example, it must have been two-way because the source was displayed and changes to the target reflects in the source. So it should be two-way. You can also have it one-way to source if you don't want to show the object, but still, if the user types something, it should be reflected in the source. And there'll always be a default. And so we saw that for entries, default was two-way, but for other controls, one-way could be the default. Okay, so as I say, if two-way or one-way to source, and the target is reflected in written to the source. So changes in target is reflected in the source. So binding to entry is the default two-way. And you can change this. Let's try to change it. So that means we go to this one and we say inside this binding construction, we say mode equals, and you can see one-way. And we shall see what happens. Okay, so Bob is displayed. Okay, but let's try and change this age and see that it's reflected in this person. It is reflected in the person. Ah, that was really strange. What did I change? I changed it for the name, but not for the age. So the age is still two-way. Let's try and change this one. No, it's still Bob, but his age has changed. Okay. So we have these four descriptions of what they are here. So one-way and one-way to source, two-way, I described those. And one time is like you display the source in the target, but only when you take a new object. Each time you set binding context, this one happens, but only once. Okay, you should try this out for yourself. Make a small example, play around with the binding mode, see if you can make everything work. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye-bye.